Hey, my name's ShawNshawN. I sell art on ShawNshawN.co and screen reads on ShawNshawNacting.com. We'll see how much longer. I never get any leads. But anyway, I like my lighting. It's way better today. Today we're going to review Candyman.
Times by looking in the mirror.
Candyman.
I feel
So yeah, I definitely got to do I definitely have to do the light at night. I always film during the day because it's easier, but the lighting here is just killer. Maybe if I get blackout curtains or something, I got to figure it out. But this looks 1,000 times better than my normal videos. But live and learn, right? So this film, Candyman, is directed by Nia Dacosta. It's an hour and 31 minutes, so right at the sweet spot. I like an hour and a half, very quickly paced. We have Yahya Adul-Matee II, as Anthony McCoy, the artist. We have Parris as Brianna Cartwright. I think she plays the girlfriend, the gallery sales. Nathan Stewart-Jarrett plays Troy Cartwright, her gay brother. Colman Domingo plays William Burke. I think that's his white boyfriend, I'm not sure. Kaminsky plays Grady Greenburg. So the story is this young artist, he lives with his girlfriend who's also a gallerist, and he stumbles upon the urban myth of Candyman, and he's like really intrigued by who Candyman is, and he decides to focus his next artist series around Candyman because he's having kind of a little bit, he's just choking on what to paint next, and he hasn't painted in a while. So then he stumbles upon Candyman. He's like, oh, this is just totally my art, right? He inadvertently calls forth Candyman, and Candyman starts leaving a trail of bodies behind him, unfortunately, related to the art world and later teenagers. So, and then he starts to discover on a terrible discovery of his birth as well. So that's a really good setup, I think, for a film. There's obviously the second one. The original one, I think, was in 92. I really liked 92. It was really well put together. This one's pretty interesting as well. A little bit different take on the original story. So it's interesting that they kind of steer away from the original story. The original story, I think, was primarily this guy was kind of a serial killer in Cabrini Green, and he got a terrible death, and now he comes back as a ghost kind of thing. This is similar, but it's also related on the terrible past of lynchings that took place in Chicago and obviously other cities around America. And so it's kind of that historical connection that's much more relevant, I think, versus a typical kind of horror film that's clean-cut origin story. Like Jason's a clean-cut origin story, Halloween is a clean-cut story, the original Candyman was. This is a little more variety and depth to it, I think. So yeah, it's like the movie serves as like a metaphor for terrible lynchings against blacks near Cabrini Green. So the artist, he accidentally summons the Candyman, and I was thinking like, dude, didn't you grow up on Candyman? Like, what person doesn't know Candyman is a horror fan, right? Or any teenagers probably seen that film. Well, maybe not all teenagers, so I guess it's relevant. If you don't watch horror films at all, you wouldn't know anything about Candyman. But kidding aside, it's kind of like, I would have seen the first movie, right? Why is there a second? Yeah, I always joke around that too about Candyman. It's just like growing up in Chicago. I actually went and partied one time in the projects. I didn't live there. I lived in the suburbs, but some black friends of mine was like, hey, you want to go to the projects? I'm like, sure, why not? And I went in the projects, and they were partying, and then I'm like, dude, there's roaches flying everywhere. I was like, I was starting to stomp the roaches, and they're like, don't bother, they're everywhere. The whole building was infected with roaches. It's terrible, right? It's like the city run, like, thing to save poor people. Is like, man, if you have the building infested with roaches, like, how are people motivated to get out of that life? That's just such a horrible, it's worse than prison, I think. I think prisons are cleaner than that, but anyway, that's a side story. But it gives you kind of a feel for the projects in Chicago, and I grew up and saw one of the projects, and these buildings were terrible. There was just the real stories where there were gangs kind of control certain floors in these projects, and sometimes they'd take sniper shots at various other gangs that were walking the block, or police officers sometimes. I mean, not too often, because obviously the police are going to raid the buildings, but generally they kind of had free reign in the buildings. Initially they weren't that way, but then the gang slowly took over the buildings. It has this kind of interesting historical background in the film with this deeper connection to lynchings going all the way back and several different versions of Candyman. So that's kind of interesting. I think they kind of lose the plot a little bit in the sense that you really want kind of a simple origin story. If you have too many layers to it, it just gets a little bit too much to think about. So, I mean, that's a good thing in a way that you want to explore police violence against blacks. I think that's very honorable, and to do it in a horror film is a really cool way to do it, because it really, I think it was always under the surface in the first film, but never really addressed, right? And this one kind of takes up more head on, I would say. And it's kind of the symbolism of the Candyman is a retribution from the past, which is kind of a cool thing. If you once you get out of the film, it kind of leaves you with this weird bizarre taste in your mouth about the messaging, and versus, you know, a simple horror film, you're kind of looking over your shoulder, you're scared. Like, I definitely checked over my soldier in my car because I have black curtains, so it's like there could be someone easily. There could be a gang hiding in the back of my van. It has so much space, you could just have like 6 people there. I wouldn't know. So I definitely opened that up and check. And I always check behind me in cars, which doesn't make any sense, but I just seen too many horror films to not think that's a logical thing to do. It probably isn't illogical at all, but hey, I'm not getting strangled. But yeah, this kind of, since they have that kind of historical touch to all these different stories, it's a little bit, I wouldn't say too much meat on the bone, but it definitely leaves you with this weird taste in your mouth. You're like, am I supposed to feel guilty of the white ancestors? And, you know, definitely, you know, the people 2, 3, 4 generations back, they're terrible people. And there's still a real issue, I think, with police violence. So that's a real issue, but in the most part, I think a lot of this doesn't exist, and it's kind of, the news kind of looks for these kind of cases and really celebrates them to really gain ratings, which is really distasteful in a way, because of course we want to watch out for that rising, but I don't think there's a real, I think the police need to be reformed, so to say. So this movie is kind of touching on that, and they've always had the connection from, like in the slave period, the police were really, they had normal police, but they also had slave catchers. And once the slavery went away, the slave kind of police got melded into the real police, and they carried forward, and that's why you have kind of this lynching behind the scene. There's really kind of the original slave police that would catch slaves. These guys became kind of what later became the KKK, what later became racist police. And they haven't been able to kind of sort that out, unfortunately, out of the police completely. And also the historical fear has always been under the surface, which no one talked about, but fear of slave revolts was a real thing in the South. You know, the slaves would revolt and they would kill off the white family, and then obviously the white families around would surround and then kill the slaves, re-enslave them, put someone else in power, similar to what happens in Django Unchained. That was a real thing that happened all the time, that they would have slave revolts. It wasn't really covered in history, but once in a while they would slave revolt and they would, you know, terrorize their white owners, which they were just justified, right? But this deep-seated fear of black slave revolts within the white population, as those people moved around the states, they kind of seeded that fear in the rest of the white population, especially with the black slave trade police. Once they melded in the police and they probably diversified around the U.S., they brought that fear to the rest of the U.S., while probably before there wasn't that much of a fear outside of the Confederate states. Like the Deep South was definitely like well seated in that, but the non-slave states, I don't think they had that much of an issue. There was definitely high discrimination, you know, and all that, but I don't think there was this deep-seated fear where the police, you know, saw a black person, they just shot him, like, oh my God, it's a crazy person coming to kill us. And it's like, no, dude, you're just supposed to arrest them, right? And so that, unfortunately, that legacy has transitioned through a lot of American police, and they really haven't weeded it out. And I don't know if there's a really good way to weed it out. I mean, I guess you could hire all minority police maybe and weed that out, but who knows? Maybe that's the only way to do it. I don't know. They've had definitely different people have thought about it recently, like with defund the police and all those kind of subject matters, and then that's led to people directly cutting funds for the police, which may not have been the original intent behind defund the police, but they used this unfortunate wording of defund the police instead of I would vote for demilitarize the police. I mean, they shouldn't have SWAT, they shouldn't have snipers, they shouldn't have tanks, they shouldn't have these armored vehicles. I would take that all away, go back to kind of Andy Griffin world where it's just shotgun, you got a pistol, that's it, you know? And if you have to fight dangerous gangsters, you keep calling more and more police. And it's a terrible situation for the police, but then no one feels dominated by the police the way they are now with SWAT and these crazy riot police and everything. It's just way over the top. You need that in some scenarios, but yeah, it's not a good scenario to be in if, you know, society has to result to that kind of policing that's really close to dictatorship. So that's another whole ball of wax, but, you know, that's kind of where we are right now in society, and this film is reflecting a lot of those kind of realities a little bit. I don't know if it's for the good or the bad for the film, because, like, if you take, for example, Get Out, it was kind of this clean thing of, you know, these crazy pro-Obama people, and then they turn out to be these, you know, Frankenstein family taking apart black brains and giving it to white people. It was kind of a funny concept, but it was like this terrible fear, but it was like this clean concept, I would say, in the sense that it's just one family. It's not like all white people. So I think everyone could relate to it. And, you know, this one, but this film in particular, it's like there's tons of black lynchings in the background. There's tons of white terrible things that did to the black people. So then you're like, as a white person, you can't relate it to, I think, as well, because then you're like, well, does that mean I'm guilty of racism? I don't think you can blame the kids for the faults of the grandfathers, but obviously there's benefits passed along as a way. If you grow up poor versus rich, obviously, the rich people grow up more privileged. But from what I've seen in the real world, if you're not on the bottom, the bottom is very hard to get out of. But if you're just at like lower middle class, it's actually more beneficial because you're hungrier to get ahead because you grew up with wanting that little extra nice watch. You want the next or nice car. You have all the kids making fun of you. That happened to me when I went to school. Kids made fun of me. My mom was always short money, so our clothes were too small. People made fun of my clothes. And so I saved all my lunch money specifically just to buy Guess and all these trendy brands as clothing to look rich. But I was just starving at school. I saved all my lunch money to buy that. And then later I started working at McDonald's and things like that. And so I think, that kind of motivation is good. But if you get to the dire poverty, then it's really tough. But I think some of that is really good. If you look at rich kids who grow up under it, like say Paris Hilton, she's really destroying the whole brand of the Hiltons because she grew up rich. While as her grandfather who started the brand, he was hungry and poor and kind of started that brand and then just hammered it, right? And he was a good businessman. The second generation is okay, and then Parris is just trashing the whole brand. I mean, they're actually changing the brand name from Hilton to Conrad to cover up Paris Hilton because she's destroyed the brand so badly. But that's kind of what happens with generational wealth. It kind of disappears. People don't think that happens, but it really does disappear over time. There's some that survive and do okay. Like I think there's one of the news broadcasters on CNN. He's one of the original Carnegie wealth, so he has a lot of money, but he pretends he doesn't. But it's the guy with the white hair. I can't remember his name off the top of my head. But anyway, that's a huge side tangent. The other thing that makes you question on this film is why is there so few black horror films, right? It's such a great genre to bring up. I think in the 70s there was, what would they call those? I can't remember what they're called, but they have these wild stereotypes and it's black gangs and stuff. But it wasn't really a black horror film, but it was like black gangs get retribution against the police or something like that effect. But they didn't really have black horror films. I mean, the very first one I know of is kind of Candyman, and then later with Jordan Peele, he did Get Out, and I think he had a follow-up one, Us. And so that's 3 films out of all the whole genre of like horror film, which goes all the way back to Dracula, right, and vampires. And you're like, why couldn't they done a black vampires or why couldn't they done a black Dracula? And it's interesting because if you look at those old horror films, they're all like white characters, and there might be one single black person, they get killed off in the film. They're the token black person in there, and that's kind of like what South Park makes fun of. They always have Token, who's this black kid, and he always gets fun of, and he's called Token, which is a terrible thing, but it's so true. With Hollywood, they've used minorities in the past as just kind of side characters, but never the main characters. They were always afraid they wouldn't be able to sell a big film to the white audience, and yeah, I think films like Candyman and especially Get Out and Us, they really prove that you could sell it to a broader audience. You have to have a little bit of diversity in there, but you can have primarily black characters and people like it. I mean, I love watching black comedy and stuff as well. So it's just kind of like, I don't know where they got this false read of, people only in the urban centers are going to like this. I've lived in the urban center, so I guess I do fit that genre per se, but I also lived in the country and I thought it was funny, but whatever, I guess when it comes to it, the producers in Hollywood, they want to make the most maximum dollars. So that's why they're always kind of trending behind the trends in that sense. But now I think they're kind of correcting a little bit of that, so that's a good thing to see. I loved in the story, they had this origin of the baby, and it was like this crazy backstory, and you're like, what does this have to do with the story? And then it kind of connects full circle at the end of the film, which is a really nice way to have that kind of come together, and you have a like pulling back the onion, and then it kind of stitches all together at the end. You want to see it in the story, so I think that was very cool. And also at the beginning and the end on the credits, they have these stick figures with shadows, kind of very primitive theater that you would have, kind of puppet theater. I've seen that in Spain. They do with little puppets, and they do it in front. It was like how they did it in the medieval times. For the poor people, the rich people would have real actors, and the poor people would have these little theater plays, micro theater plays, so to say. And so probably the slaves would have had this with paper mache kind of thing, with just they'd have a couple scraps of paper, they might have put it together. I think personally it would have just been mostly oral histories told, so really great people that would tell the stories. They might not have used paper mache, but it's a great metaphor, I think, in the sense that is a possibility that they had kind of these paper theaters and they tell the story through the paper figures, and it's really great with just the shadows. And when they show the end in the credits, you're just like, okay, it's just like your typical credits. They're going to show some stuff, but it actually feels like it's just the story is percolating, and you're like, ooh, is there like an end scene at the very end of the credits that I should stick around for. I only stuck around for maybe 3/4 of the credits, but normally I never stick around for the credits because they're just boring, right? And that's fine that most films do it boring. But it is kind of nice if you throw it together, you make the credits actually interesting. People want to watch the credits. I don't think they take in the credits much more than they actually see the scenes and then the scroll. They don't really think they see that unless they're involved with filmmaking. I might notice a little bit, but even I don't really watch that, and I like film a lot. So, but I know they have to do that. It's kind of like one of those things. The film, they have the credits at the beginning for the major, and then they have the credits at the end. But it's really great when you see kind of scenes put together and you actually have the trailer as its own kind of scene in the movie in a way, and the beginning as well. So I think that's a really creative thing that you can add to a film. So I would also say use that in future films. I'd recommend the film. It's pretty interesting. A little bit disturbing. Again, it's going to leave like this weird taste in your mouth. But I think you could say also just the recent events with, various kids that were taken out by the police, like Trayvon Martin, and then all the way up. Now we had recently the other guy who got strangled for selling cigarettes on the street, and that led to the Black Lives Matter kind of movement, and then the reaction to that. You had the Please Lives Matter and All Lives Matter and all this ruckus. Yeah, I don't know if they really changed anything, but it was good that they had that movement. But I think this film kind of is digesting that and hasn't fully digested the movement. So I don't know if that helped the film or hurt the film in a way. Obviously, the directors and the writers kind of want to talk about that. And I think film is a great way to discuss those, especially with the younger audience. Like teenagers, they're really kind of spaced out. They're just watching teenager stuff. And they're not really soaking in history in depth like a lot of people should. Like they try to teach in school, but they kind of whitewash it literally. Because there's literally just go civil rights and they go Civil War and there's nothing in between, right? They don't cover any of the lynchings or black achievements along the way. They covered a little bit in Black History Month now, but I think they do a really great disservice. Like I didn't know about, for example, Juneteenth until I talked to a black from Texas and they told me the origin story. I was like, wow, why wasn't this in part of school? And why wasn't this a holiday? And they just made it a holiday and you're like, well, that's 200 years late on the holiday, right? I mean, I guess they were celebrating Lincoln as the Emancipation Proclamation and all that, but out of this one date with slaves is like, seems more important to me than Lincoln's birthday. I mean, he was the one that kind of sparked. He had the power to transition the Civil War, so to say. But there were many people that went into it, like Harriet Tubman and the writer of Uncle Tom's Cabin, where you get the term Uncle Tom and all that stuff. But that's really critical to the history of blacks and American history in general. But yeah, I'd recommend the film. If you'd like to subscribe, you can subscribe below. And I'll see you in the next movie review. Thanks for watching, guys.